My name is Richard McKenny. I'm registered as a social worker and a family therapist, and I work as part of the Creative Therapies team. And I've had a role in developing a project in relation to sleep, diet and exercise with City of London. And Rachel's going to speak a little bit later about City of London's experience, and with Pathfinders, which is a residential care provider in north of London, and Ebenezer and hopefully Aisha and Apong are going to join us for a little bit of a discussion about what learning a little bit more about sleep, diet and exercise is meant to them. So I'm going to present some slides first, and then we'll maybe have a bit of a discussion. I have got a couple of breaks in the slides. I'm essentially going to talk about 3 different things, and I've got a couple of breaks where we might take some questions. So if you have got questions, if you put them in the question and answer bar at the time, because we'll maybe try and come to those as we go along, and then maybe there'll be more general questions, and Catherine might come back in and so on at the end. Okay, I'm going to screen share and just ask if everyone can see, or let me know if you can't see, Hayley, my slides. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a trauma-focused approach to thinking about sleep, diet and exercise interventions. And I guess I just want to say, I mean, these are not subjects in which I have the kind of expertise that Catherine so obviously has. But I think it's fair to say that we're confident that the interventions we're suggesting, we don't think of any iatrogenic risk. So we don't think by doing any of these things you can cause young people harm. So sleeping well, eating well, and exercising properly are kind of indisputably good things. Okay, so I'll give an overview of some of the evidence from reputable sources, and then we'll consider the implications for the evidence. And we'll look at the project we've been working with Pathfinders in City of London on. And our focus is going to be on unaccompanied asylum-seeking young people. But I hope as you're talking and listening, you'll have a sense that the implications go wider. And I just want to carefully distinguish between traumagenic experiences that might lead to PTSD type difficulties and more developmental and relational trauma, which is obviously a huge concern and an area where social workers and others are thinking a lot about. But I'm not today talking about that kind of complex early developmental trauma and the impact of ACEs and so on. I'm talking more about trauma in later life. There's an intersection and an overlap to be thought about, and we may be able to do that a little later in the question and answers. So a little bit about the history of our project. Coram started doing some work in relation to unaccompanied young people and the difficulties that they have settling into the UK from about 2006. And a colleague of ours, Dr. Anna Draper, led a project for Kent and then came to work with Coram and brought these ideas into our service. And when there were a lot of young people arriving in the Kent ports at that time, and there still are a lot of young people arriving, there was a need for a really practical intervention that supported young people with their difficulty sleeping and with their gastrointestinal symptoms, and then with trauma-related preoccupations, worried about families and worries about the process of seeking asylum and the experiences that they'd had on their journeys to the UK. So I'll just talk a little bit about the prehistory of PTSD, very briefly, just to say that signs of trauma, there's evidence of discussion of signs of trauma all through kind of recorded human history. You can look at the Bible and you can look at early myths and legends, and certainly from the sort of 1700s onwards, as war fighting became more industrialized, there's lots of evidence that people were experiencing psychological injury as part of that. We're all very familiar with the idea of shell shock as an experience that some young soldiers had in World War I. But PTSD as a diagnosis really comes into DSM-3, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association in the 1980s, in relation to the experience of Vietnam War veterans. So there's lots of sources that we could look at to think about how what history has to tell us about dealing with trauma. But this one was the one I chose to talk about today, looking at the effects of trauma on young soldiers in the First World War. And if you watch television or films or so on, you get the impression that young people who had shell shock in World War I were all kind of taken back to a country house somewhere in Hampshire and given 6 months rest, and some of them might have gone back to the war or not. But actually, that strategy ended a few months into the war. And what doctors involved in the process found was that keeping young people near to the front line, within earshot, so they could hear the fighting, being emotionally supported by their comrades, and being given lots of rest, had a better prognosis for being able to return to fighting. I may feel quite ambivalent about that, about the idea of young people being kind of given some rest and then put back in the front line where, many of them were going to die. But some of the learning from that, I think, that we take away is that there are some of the ways in which we might think about trauma are perhaps counterintuitive. So the principles that were developed at that time for how to treat young people with trauma symptoms included immediacy, proximity, expectancy, simplicity, and centrality. So treating as early as possible before acute stress set in and became symptomatic. Treating people near the front line, and I would say, treating people near their homes, their own communities, not taking them away from the community that they were raised in. Expectancy, so being optimistic about the idea that trauma symptoms can be overcome. Using really simple treatments, so rest, sleep, and practical psychotherapy were the interventions that were most effective at that time. And organizing your services coherently, so that everyone knows what they're doing and why they're doing it, and there's a coherent kind of escalating plan of action in terms of interventions. So from the wider evidence, what we know is that only a minority of people who experience significant trauma will develop PTSD. One of the factors mediating whether or not someone will develop PTSD type symptoms is the way in which they make meaning out of their experiences, so that community becomes very important. And the evidence for that is widespread. There's the forward treatment protocols in World War I. There's also the effects of the Blitz on the population of London. So there were lots of preparations made in the lead up to the Blitz to extend psychiatric provision for civilians. There was an assumption that when the Blitz came, lots of people were going to need psychiatric beds in hospitals. It didn't happen. Similarly, after the Yugoslav war, the town of Mostar was under siege for about 2 years. It was snipers, bombings, and so on. The children who lived through that and remained in Mostar were then followed up about 2 years later. And their general mental health was better on average than the average child in Russia at the same time, and was comparable to children in the United States. So we know that staying within your community and having a community around you who help you to make meaning out of experience is absolutely vital for mediating whether people are going to go on and become unwell and experience long-term chronic psychological difficulties. So all of that has very significant implications for how we treat unaccompanied children when they come into the country, and then as they're processed and the dispersal policy and so on. So in relation to chronic stress and traumatogenic experiences, what we might take away from this is that well-coordinated practical interventions involving peers should be a first-line approach, and that we need well-coordinated psychological interventions available when required. Contact with peers is very helpful. Hopefulness about the future and expectation for recovery is really important. And careful monitoring and review with quick access to specialist intervention. So knowing what to look for and what to review as we go along. I'm just going to talk briefly about the idea of salutogenesis. It's an idea that's not so widely talked about in the UK. It's a way of thinking about health and well-being that was developed in Israel by Aaron Antonovsky in the 1970s. And Antonovsky was studying the menopause in women in Israel, and in the 1970s, those women would have been in their late teens and early 20s at the time that the Holocaust was happening, and they then made a journey to Israel over land, a very difficult journey for many. And what he noticed was that some of those women had done quite well in life and others had really struggled. So he came up with the idea of salutogenesis to try and help explain this difference. And what he said was that health and well-being are achievements rather than natural states. So being healthy and feeling well are things we have to work at. And the way we work at them is through developing what he called a sense of coherence. And a sense of coherence is made up of three components. So comprehensibility, a confidence that the experiences we've had internally and externally, so in our bodies and in the world around us, makes sense. So the way I'm feeling is the way people would feel after certain things had happened to them. Manageability, so a confidence that you have the resources at hand to meet the challenges that those events pose for you. And then meaningfulness, so the idea that the challenges that you're facing are ones that are worth engaging with. Things will get better. It's worth working through this. And I think as a framework, it's a really clear framework for social workers, foster carers, residential workers, and others to think about how they plan interventions with young people and how they organize their conversations with young people about difficult things that have happened. Poor sleep is highly correlated with mental health difficulties. And in fact, it's probably the most reliable finding that we have in the mental health field. As Catherine was saying, there's an emerging evidence base about the significance of the microbiota gut-brain axis for mental health. Although some of the early research on this was published in 1910, and there was a study at the Maudsley Hospital in South London looking at using a kefir type drink, so a kind of live yogurt drink, to treat melancholia. And that research really got buried because of the emergence of talking therapies. So the popularity of psychoanalysis arrived at the same point in time. And so we kind of lost track of some of this knowledge and understanding. And then we know that there's a very good relationship between moderate exercise and good mental health, and heart rate variability is one of the mechanisms by which we can measure the impact of exercise on good mental health. It's a good sort of mediating route by which that process works. These are some slides from a paper by Russell Forrester, who's an adult psychiatrist, we used to work in West London, but is now at Oxford, who's done a lot of work on mental health and sleep. These are just some summary slides from a paper he and his team published in 2010, looking at the impacts of sleep on the body and on feeling states. And so lack of sleep, poor sleep, has a really significant impact on our emotional responses in terms of how we feel, how we experience stress, and on our overt behavior and how we behave in the world. Similarly, poor sleep has a huge impact on cognition, on our ability to attend and concentrate, on our ability to make new memories and learn, and on our executive functioning, so the way in which we make decisions. So for example, the way in which we might put off a short-term reward in order to work towards a more long-term goal. So things like impulsivity and risk-taking and so on all come into this. And then we know that poor sleep has a big impact on our bodies. So there are many somatic responses: feeling drowsy, microsleep, which is the idea of just falling asleep for like a second, half a second, a quarter of a second. And particularly, we notice it in adolescents when they appear in school to be not paying attention. And then when they're teacher says something to them, they might protest and say, oh, but I was paying attention. And actually, they've actually fallen asleep for a quarter of a second and not realized that that's what's going on. So lots of systems in the body are really affected by lack of sleep. And unaccompanied young people arrive in the UK with multiple problems in relation to sleep. So sleep reversal, they've been sleeping during the day and traveling at night, and we expect them to switch that around and sleep at night and be awake during the day. They're suffering from sleep loss, so not getting enough hours of sleep, and they're suffering from poor sleep quality. So when we are in unfamiliar surroundings or we feel stressed, and we tend to sleep less deeply, and we have the ability to sleep less deeply with just one half of our brain. And that means we're more alert, and that means we're more likely to waken up in the night, and we're more likely then to have disturbed sleep. So there are multiple ways in which sleep deprivation can come into a young person's life. So it's important that when we're thinking about young people and we're thinking about their diet and their sleep and their exercise, that we start to think about these three things together as a kind of an indivisible trinity. And I'm going to show some slides where I explain that. So in order to understand, we have to understand that there are deep relationships between sleep, diet, and exercise. But when we start to plan our interventions to think about how we can use the research to help young people, we need to start thinking in terms of a pillars metaphor. So thinking about sleep, diet, and exercise as three pillars which support good mental health. So just to talk a little bit about the kind of interaction between sleep, diet, and exercise and the way in which they might be thought of as a trinity. So trauma, safety, fear. I'm starting at the top left-hand corner and I'm working my way around. Trauma, safety, fears, and so on will disrupt sleep, and there's multiple mechanisms by which that might happen. So, preoccupying thoughts, anxiety raises body temperature, and we can't actually fall asleep unless our body temperature falls slightly. And this idea that one half of our brain might be less asleep than the other half of our brain. So that will lead directly to effects on brain functioning, and that can interrupt the way in which we lay down memory. It can affect our mood, and altogether that can lead to less hopefulness about the future, increases in frustration, impulsivity, difficulties with emotional regulation, and then that adds to the stress that we experience, and so round the vicious circle goes. Sleep deprivation will lead to changes in food choice. So we know that people who are sleep deprived tend to select, if it's available to them, will select more refined and processed sugars and more refined and processed carbohydrates. That will then change the balance of their diet so that they have less of the prebiotics that Catherine was talking about in their guts. And Catherine talked very clearly about the way in which that then means that there are short-chain fatty acids, neurotransmitters, and precursors for neurotransmitters become less available for the brain, and then that will impact our mood, and then that leads to decreases in motivation, decreased sense of well-being, decreased resilience. We know that trauma and stress has a global and general suppressing effect on the immune system. That will then, we know that that then damages our gut and leads to conditions like leaky gut. That then impacts our gut microbiota, that changes our moods, that changes our motivation. When motivation for exercise decreases, we exercise less, and that has an immediate impact on well-being. So exercising gives us a feeling of well-being through endorphins and so on, but it also impacts our heart rate variability. And by that, I mean it has complex consequences for the vagus system, which Lexi and Claire were talking about a little earlier. And particularly when heart rate variability lowers, the capacity for emotional regulation lowers. That then increases impulsivity, emotional volatility, and makes social interactions more difficult. And difficult social interactions for our young people leads to stress. And so the vicious circle goes round. And just to talk a little bit more about the stress on the immune system, that will lead directly to changes in mood. That will lead to impulsivity. That leads to stress. Okay, so what are the implications of all of this for practice? So there's a current bias towards these kinds of psi interventions in response to what we know about stress. And that's really to neglect other pathways for responding to stress and trauma. So Catherine was talking about, we need to be thinking more about intervening directly on these pathways, including in terms of sleep, diet, and exercise, so that we start to disrupt these vicious circles and build the pillars for good mental health. And I think the last thing to bear in mind is that we currently have no prospect of training a sufficient workforce to meet all of the demand for psychological interventions. So the current CAMHS transformation model aims to meet maybe 35% of need. So we need to really think about highly specialist CAMHS and young people's mental health services as a special resource that we need to make the best use of. And we can't really train our way out of this problem. Okay, so I think we probably need a new model of practice in children's social care, working with children in care, but particularly one that includes trauma-focused interventions at the level of sleep, diet, and exercise as foundational pillars of good mental health. So this is wide application because children's social care services can directly influence young people's sleep, diet, and exercise routines. We need a salutogenic frame. So we need optimism, hope, practical interventions, practical support. We need to be strength-based, and we need a tiered approach to how we think about sleep, diet, and exercise, so that we intervene at different levels depending on how young people respond to early interventions. And we need to make really good use of technology like smartphones and wearable devices and so on. So if we want to know how young people are sleeping, we can ask them, but we're not always great at reporting our own sleep. But if young people wear Fitbits and Apple Watches and those kinds of things, we can get a lot of really good information that we can then feed into LAC medical services and into the LAC review process and so on. So this is our proposal for what a model of intervention would look like. We need an overarching salutogenic frame. And then from left to right, we need universal services that look at sleep, diet, and exercise alongside life story work. For young people who need a bit more, we need to look at diet, individually tailored support for sleep, perhaps individual or group support with exercise. Think about biofeedback training and enhancing vagal tone, and really thinking about the community support that young people can give themselves, so peer support and culturally relevant community support. We then might move into group and individual psychological interventions, which are more widely available. So mindfulness practices, compassion-focused techniques, using narrative interventions, including what we would call a continuing bonds and narrative intervention, helping young people to stay in contact with family overseas, but also to settle into the UK. And then really at the kind of upper tier, we need trauma-focused psychological interventions like trauma-focused narrative therapy, EMDR, and trauma-focused CBT. But we need to think about this as a broad spectrum, and that a lot of the support that young people need being available before CAMHS. So there's just a little bit about what this might look like. We probably need to enhance the way we monitor and review young people's sleep, diet, and exercise needs through the LAC review process. Then we need a secondary level of support for young people who are struggling with those things and where we think there's a trauma element. And those would be located within social care services. And then we move into more CAMHS orientated services. And this is just sort of breaking it down a little bit, how we might do that. And how we've started to go about that in the City of London. So developing really clear expectations for foster carers and residential units about sleep, diet, and exercise, and training for social workers, foster carers, residential staff, and better, so that we're all able to provide better information to LAC medical services, and then enhanced monitoring and reviewing of all this through the LAC review process. We need more expert advice on sleep, diet and exercise available to social workers and others. We need consultations with young people. That's a service we've been developing. We'll be developing it with professionals, but I think we need to move towards offering consultations for young people around this. And then really practical help and support. So sleep packs, diet plans, support with accessing exercise, especially for young women. Some of the work we've done, we've been thinking about gender differences in being able to access gyms and so on. Not all young women want to walk into a gym and pick up some weights and kind of, you know, get cracking. And we need to be able to help our LAC medical services keep an eye on all of this more effectively. Then we probably need mainly group-based interventions, so psychoeducational and practical learning of mind-body practices. Jasmine was talking earlier about mindfulness, those kinds of interventions, as well as individual narrative-based interventions at maybe, you know, tier 2.5, tier 3 in CAMHS. So could be offered in schools, colleges, in the community, doesn't necessarily have to be offered in a tier 3 CAMHS service. And then finally, we need these highly specialist services which are focused on trauma for young people for whom these other interventions have not been effective. And we need to be able to respond quickly and help people move through these services. And we need to make sure that the more specialist services are available for young people who really need them. So what would some of this look like? The area that I'm interested in, the sort of second circle, we might look at increased probiotic consumption. So, and that's with the intention of helping young people improve mood. So bringing yogurt and kefirs and other things into diets. We might
Richard,
be looking.
Just to say, we're running out of time, so if you just bear in mind.
Yeah. And then you know, really focusing on education, on exercise, the kind of exercise that young people want to engage with. And then in terms of biofeedback, training in vagal tone, there are some interesting ideas about using breathing, but also using wearable devices and using things. If young people want to go cold water swimming up at the reservoir, then that's great for their vagal tone and that's great for their mental health. So the project we ran last year with Rachel and colleagues and Ebenezer and colleagues was that we offered 4x2-hour virtual training program for a range of staff at different levels of the organization. We offered consultation then to staff in residential units, and we independently evaluated that. And the residential staff were working with the young people directly. And what we're thinking about and looking forward to and hoping to do this year is perhaps extend training to foster carers, trial some assessment forms that we've been developing so that we can record information about sleep, diet and exercise more effectively, working directly with young people who are preparing for independent living, educating them around these topics, enhancing our links with LAC medical teams and perhaps virtual schools and others, working with IROs to look at the reviewing process and how we can get this more into the conversation in looked after children's reviews, developing our continuing bonds narrative therapy offer, and then doing some further evaluation.
Thank you, Richard.
We're hoping for the future. Thank you, Renika.
Thank you. I just now want, if we can, to have Pathfinders, Care and Rachel on the screen. Is that possible?
Yeah, so I'm Rachel and I'm the service manager for children's social care and early help in the city. It's an unusual social care provision in that we have generic caseloads and we work with children from early help through to leaving care, all within the same one small service. And we've been working with Richard and Coram on this sleep, diet, exercise project for unaccompanied asylum children.
And Ebenezer, if you just introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ebenezer Poplampo. I'm the Director of Pathfinders Care Services. We are a semi-independent placement for young people, 16 plus.
And Aisha?
Hi, my name is Aisha. I'm a senior support worker with Pathfinders Care Services. I work with young people, 16 plus, and also with asylum seekers.
And what I wanted to ask you, I'll start with Rachel. in terms of an overview, and the city actually has a number of unaccompanied young people, don't you, Rachel? And also because you've worked with children in care more generally, what is your observation in relation to what we've been talking about, diet and sleep and exercise? Not necessarily about our project as such, because we don't want to use you as a sort of advertising for the project, but does it make sense to you, Rachel?
I mean, sleep, diet and exercise are all included as part of our core work in terms of Black health, looks after children's health and well-being. But I think it's the attention to asking questions about it much more, rather than somebody saying, yeah, I do sleep well. Well, actually going further, or actually, what time are you speaking to your family? Oh, I wake up at 4 to kind of go and call my family members. So actually it is disrupted. So sleep, diet and exercise always important. But actually it really impacts if people are not having good enough sleep to pay attention in college. People are falling asleep or not attending. So it's core, but in terms of the work we've been doing, I think it's the attention to detail and going back and asking more and being much more curious about the quality of sleep. That's been a real richness about what we get back. And I think the love and care that's shown by being as curious as possible about those practical things that make such a big difference to children. It's really practical, rather than, oh yes, you've done an independent living school, you can cook 5 meals. Well, actually, it's not. It's about eating for your well-being and your body and mind, the health of your body and mind. That's been good. It's the level of curiosity, I think, that has been brought about, which is really good.
And Ebenezer and Aisha, Ebenezer, coming to you first. You've been running supported accommodation for many years, and I know how hard it is from when Coram used to offer that. What do you think about this sense of the way trauma is sometimes expressed by not being able to sleep, being rather chaotic in your exercise and your diet? Does it make sense to you what Richard and Catherine have been saying? The sense of cohesion, community, coming from a different country, because you've been in caring for a number of the US from the city. What are your observations from what you've heard, Ebenezer?
Thank you very much, Renuka. I think, yes, we do support a lot of unaccompanied asylum-seeking young people. And sometimes when they come to us, we do realize that some of them are not really sleeping well because of the journeys, because of their experience, because of the cultural change, arriving in a new country where they don't have any family relations or connections or friends. Very anxious sometimes about their immigration statuses and what's going to happen to them and all that. So there's a whole range of factors that impact on the young people, especially some of these things that impact on their sleep patterns. So we have had the opportunity of engaging in the training, and that has given us more awareness of what to look out for these young people. I mean, we've now shown more interest in getting to understand why some of these young people may be waking up in the middle of the night, coming to knock on the staff door. This training has actually helped us to understand the range of factors that might be impacting on them, and being able to support them and signpost them to the right services or resources. We have also now incorporated in our service level discussions, our team meetings, and our supervision with my staff we have an acronym called SEE, sleep, eat, and exercise. So in supervision or in team meetings, we do discuss how are you ensuring that your young person is sleeping well? Are you doing the sessions that we had with yourselves? Are the staff members able to do the sleep routines and the other stuff with the young people? Are we supporting them to eat healthily, their diet and all that? Because obviously from all the discussions that we've had today, the diet also impact on their sleep sometimes. We had a young person, for instance, who was not sleeping well. And after doing a session on the diet thing with a young person, he wanted just to eat his local meal or food. Once we were able to do that and support him to get that particular food that he wanted, that changed his whole personality. He started sleeping well. He, normally he would stay on very late, but as soon as we were able to get that for that young person, we took him somewhere where he can get that local dish or meal. And we saw a very big improvement. Now, exercise is also very key. We have been encouraging our young people to exercise a lot. We've got local gyms that we register our young people to. And also we've got mini gyms. When the COVID started, we realized our young people were not able to access the gyms. So we managed to get mini gyms in all our facilities, and the young people did engage really well, and that impacted positively on their lives, emotional well-being, and their sleep patterns. So yes, there's a whole range of factors. What are the other key thing as well that I'm going to say is that, sometimes it's not just about the diet, it's not just about the exercise, it's also about worries about their immigration status. For our young people, you may know, or we do all these things with the young people. We do the sleep hygiene and all that, but sometimes they're still struggling to sleep. Sometimes the other social economic factors, home office issues, money, finances, some of them have to send money back home and all that. And some of them, they hear of the sound of a car, or sometimes color, in the placement and all that's impact on them. So there might be other factors apart from sleep that impacts on the young people that we work with. Thank you. Sure. I'll give Aisha the chance to.
Yes, and Aisha, there's a multitude of factors, and I will come to you, Rachel, to close really at the end after I've spoken to Aisha, because Rachel, the partnership, the sort of the corporate parenting responsibility lies with you. And that's a very difficult one, given all the multitude of factors for all our children, but particularly our children in care and some of our newer children in care whose history we don't necessarily know. But Aisha, Richard and I had the privilege of meeting with you and some of your colleagues. And one of the things that we noticed in supported housing is just the turnover of staff, really. I mean, it is there in health as well. And how sleep and you've been with Pathfinders for a while now, and some of the others we worked with had too, but actually enabling something that helped a conversation about practical things that then led to people's emotional health, basically. Do you want to comment on your experience with sleep, diet and exercise and those conversations?
Thank you, Renuka. I think, like you rightly said, the impact of having the staff turnover on young people, that can also have an impact on them, because it's important to have some kind of continuity. And fortunately for us, we've managed to maintain most of our staff members and the same staff members working with the young people for a continued period of time. So we established that relationship where we can work with them. They can open up to us and speak to us about anything that is worrying them, which is really helpful in supporting them. Because I've had experiences with young people who literally refer to me as their mom, because they've come to the point where they can talk to me about anything, because I've been working with them for a long time and built that healthy relationship with them. In terms of the practical things that we've done, like Ebenezer rightly said, through the training sessions, prior to the training sessions, we were aware of some of the traumas that they've been through, but the training sessions really gave us more insight into how it impacts on them as individuals, in their education, in their general well-being, and everything that they go through. So learning about how to even have conversations with them about what they've been through, to understand what's going on with them, has been really, really helpful. Using the BERS tool, the distress tools, and going through the sleep hygiene exercises with them has really, really been helpful. So practical things like helping them to choose the right kind of foods, because with the training, we've come to understand how important diet is in relation to sleep. So we've sat to them, go through what they normally buy when they go shopping, explain to them the benefits of certain kinds of foods, encouraging them to eat those foods has been really helpful. And because we have good relationship, when we make some of these suggestions with them, they take it on board and they try it. We go back and review this with them, and it's really, really been helpful for our young people. And same with exercise, and also the general activities that we engage them in to take their minds off everything that they're doing. So it's a number of things that we do practically to help them to settle down, forget about the things they're going through, or to deal with them in a better way, and also help them to sleep well.
Thank you, Aisha. Rachel, we've literally got a couple of minutes left. Just to kind of, it's been a useful way of thinking, isn't it? Forget Coram unnecessarily, but it's been useful, this kind of trilogy, hasn't it?
It's been great. And I think as corporate parents, it's been great having people on the ground, the key workers and soon to be foster carers as well, learning alongside our social workers at every level and talking about it. So what Aisha is doing and Ebenezer is doing one-to-one with the young people is being mirrored by the social workers and mirrored by the managers asking questions, and also mirrored again by the IROs and the review. So it's the whole system supporting the sleep, diet and exercise, which makes it stronger with the whole system working that way. Also, it's helpful for staff. When they did the staff training, everyone was buying kefir as well and taking care of our own sleep and diet during COVID. But it's just been the love and care that is shown by the curiosity around food. I think it's really practical with some practical solutions underpinned by really good theory, so you can go as deeply as you like. But I'm really looking forward to the foster carers being trained up as well, and then the whole system is paying attention really carefully to something that's the core of our well-being, and it isn't just oh, are you sleeping? Well, it's actually, how do you know, are you having dreams, etc. The sleep hygiene packs are very useful, and our cupboard smells of lavender delightfully because all the sleep hygiene packs are there and given out. But it's good to have something tangible for the young people to hold when talking about it, rather than just always doing face-to-face talking. Well, actually, you can talk about some of the things in the sleep hygiene pack, such as the smells of the lavender, etc. So it's quite a tangible, practical tool, as well as having really good, strong theory.
And really important in, as Richard said, being able to differentiate the ones that need more specialist treatment.
Absolutely, and we across have that, yeah.
And so what we're hoping to do is to work with some local authorities to gain some funding from various sources, to work with Pathfinders and others who've been in our pilot to take these ideas further. Carol, did you just want to say a final goodbye?
Yes, this is a final goodbye, and I'd like to give my thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We have in our hands, I think, some really important ingredients for progress, and I look forward to everyone's energies and proposals on how we seize the moment, because we know that young people from all the backgrounds that we've described today need us to do so. And my final remarks of thanks go to Renika for convening us to do so, but also for her eternal passion for children and young people, which is central to everything that she does and everything that Coram does. So thank you very much indeed.